$22.31. That's what the receipt said, sitting crumpled on my kitchen counter next to a bag of tomato fertilizer I'd bought that morning, the fancy blue kind with a label that promised bigger, redder tomatoes by August. I'd fed my plants exactly what the bag told me to. 2 weeks later, the leaves on 3 of my tomato plants had gone yellow at the edges, curling up like they were trying to get away from something. And the fruit that did set was small and split before it even ripened. I stood there in my garden with dirt under my nails, looking at plants that should have been thriving, and I thought about my grandmother's garden, the one she kept behind a farmhouse in a little town most people have never heard of, with no fertilizer bags at all, just a wheelbarrow and a pile of something that came straight out of the barn. Her tomatoes never looked like mine did that August. Hers looked like something out of a seed catalog every single year for as long as anybody could remember. Here's what I want to show you today. A handful of practices, old ones, cheap ones, that turn a struggling backyard garden into the kind of garden that gets better every single year instead of worse. None of it involves anything you can't get for pennies on the dollar compared to what's sitting on the shelf at the garden center. None of it will hurt your soil, your plants, or your wallet. And by the time we're done, you'll know exactly what to buy, exactly what to skip, and exactly how much money you can expect to keep in your pocket by the end of the season. My name is Linda. I've kept a house and grown a garden for over 40 years, through good years and lean ones, feeding a family on one paycheck while my husband Earl worked long days keeping up an old 60-room motel down in Florida. There wasn't extra money for garden centers back then. If a tomato plant was going to survive, it survived on what I could scrounge, borrow, or make myself. I learned to read a garden the way some folks read a book, by watching it, not by following whatever the bag told me to do. And what I learned from watching and from women in my own family who garden long before garden centers even existed still works better than anything you'll find with a barcode on it. So here's what I'm going to walk you through today. The exact methods that kept gardens like my grandmother's producing generation after generation, without a single bag of synthetic fertilizer, without expensive equipment, and without the soil ever wearing out. And here's the part that ought to bother you a little. This isn't some secret nobody's ever heard of. It's just older than the industry that sells you garden supplies, and that industry doesn't make a dime off dirt you already have in your backyard or seeds you saved yourself last fall. Nobody's plotting against you. They just don't lose any sleep over the fact that you don't know what already works, because if you did, you'd stop buying what they're selling. Stay with me. By the end of this, you're going to look at your garden completely differently, and you're going to save yourself a small fortune doing it. Here's what most folks get wrong, and I got it wrong myself for longer than I'd like to admit. We think a tired, struggling garden needs more. More fertilizer, more water, more chemicals to kill whatever's eating the leaves. But a garden that needs constant rescuing isn't a garden that needs more. It's a garden that's missing something basic, something underneath all of that. It's missing living soil. Store-bought fertilizer feeds a plant the way a candy bar feeds a kid, a quick jolt that doesn't last and does nothing at all for what's happening underground. The soil itself, the little world of bacteria and fungi and earthworms that's supposed to be down there working for you, gets skipped right over. Feed the plant instead of the ground it's growing in, and you'll be back at the garden center every single season, spending more money for smaller harvests, wondering why it never gets any easier. Let's start with what goes into the ground before anything else. My grandmother's secret weapon wasn't a secret at all. It just wasn't glamorous. It was aged manure, mixed straight into the garden beds every fall. If you've got access to a horse, a cow, a chicken coop, even a neighbor with any of those, you've got a nearly free source of exactly what a struggling garden needs. Fresh manure needs to sit and age for a few months before it goes near your vegetables because fresh manure is strong enough to burn tender roots and can carry bacteria you don't want anywhere near your dinner table. But aged, composted manure works into soil like nothing you'll find in a bag. It doesn't just feed the plant, it feeds the whole underground community that makes a garden healthy year after year, loosening compacted dirt and helping it hold water the way a sponge does instead of running straight through like sand. If manure isn't something you can get your hands on, you can build the same result with compost, which costs you nothing but time and kitchen scraps, and I'll walk you through exactly how to get that hot and working fast in just a minute. Once your soil is being fed properly, the next thing that changes everything is what you plant where and how you rotate it. Most home gardeners plant tomatoes in the same corner every single year, peppers in the same row, and then they wonder why the harvest gets smaller and the bugs get worse each season. Families who've gardened the same plot for generations, the kind of families who still garden the way my grandmother did, follow a simple rotation instead. Corn or another heavy feeder goes in one year, pulling a lot of nitrogen out of the soil as it grows. The next year, that same ground gets planted with beans or peas, because those plants belong to a family that does something almost nobody realizes. Legumes, with a little help from bacteria that live right on their roots, pull nitrogen out of the air itself and store it in the soil. So the ground that looked worn out after corn comes back richer than it started. The third year, something that spreads and covers ground. Squash works well, or pumpkins, or melons, goes in that same spot. The big leaves choke out weeds without you lifting a finger, and the roots dig down and break up soil that's gotten hard and compacted. And the fourth year, you let that ground rest, planting something like clover or winter rye instead of a vegetable crop at all, just to rebuild what the last 3 years used up. That resting year isn't wasted time. It's the reason the whole cycle keeps working, instead of wearing the soil down to nothing. I remember the summer I finally tried this in my own backyard, back when our kids were still small enough to help, which mostly meant digging holes in places I hadn't asked for holes. I moved my tomatoes to a bed where I'd grown beans the year before, and I didn't add a speck of store-bought fertilizer. Those were the biggest tomatoes I ever grew in that yard, before or since. I didn't understand the science of it back then. I just knew it worked. The same way my grandmother knew it worked, because she'd watched it work her whole life, and her mother had watched it before her. Rotating your crops only gets you so far if you're starting each season with the wrong seeds, though. Most of us walk into a store every spring and buy seed packets bred for uniformity, bred to look pretty on a shelf and ship well across the country, not bred to survive your particular patch of dirt with your particular weather. Families who save their own seeds year after year end up, after enough seasons, with plants that are practically custom built for their exact backyard. A tomato plant that struggled in dry weather doesn't get its seeds saved. The one that pulled through gets saved, and its seeds go in the ground next year, and the year after that, until you've got a variety that's been quietly adapting to your soil and your climate for longer than you've probably lived in your house. It costs you nothing but a little patience, letting a few of the healthiest fruits go fully ripe instead of picking them all, then drying and storing the seeds somewhere cool and dry. Compare that to spending anywhere from $100 to a couple $100 a year on fresh seed packets, and you start to see why families who've been doing this for generations never seem to be buying much of anything come spring. Watering trips up more gardeners than almost anything else, and it surprised me too when I first heard how little the old-timers actually watered. Not daily, the way most of us have been taught to do it. Deep, thorough watering just twice a week, right at the base of the plant, at the soil level, not sprayed over the top of the leaves. Watering the leaves themselves is asking for trouble because wet foliage sitting overnight is exactly the kind of thing that invites fungus and disease. Watering deeply but less often forces roots to grow downward, searching for moisture, instead of staying lazy and shallow near the surface, where the first hot, dry week will kill them. Morning is the best time to do it too, somewhere between 6 and 8, before the sun gets high enough to evaporate half of what you just put down. If you can rig up something as simple as a barrel up on a stand with a hose running down to your garden beds, gravity does the work of a pump, and you'll use noticeably less water than a sprinkler ever would, while getting healthier, more drought-tolerant plants out of the deal. Pests are where most folks reach straight for a spray bottle, and I understand the instinct, because nobody wants to watch bugs strip a tomato plant bare overnight. But there's an older way of handling this, and it costs you a packet of flower seeds instead of a bottle of chemicals. Marigolds planted along your vegetable rows have long been used to discourage certain soil pests around the roots. Basil planted near tomatoes is something gardeners have relied on for generations to help keep hornworms away. And it happens to make your tomato sauce taste better too, which is about as good a deal as gardening gets. Nasturtiums work as what's called a trap crop, meaning the beetles and bugs go after the nasturtiums first, leaving your actual vegetables mostly alone, and you can just pull the nasturtiums out once they've done their job attracting the trouble away from your dinner. None of this kills anything beneficial, the way a broad chemical spray does. Ladybugs and lacewings, the insects that actually eat the pests you're trying to get rid of, stick around and keep doing their job instead of dying alongside everything else. Now, let's get that compost pile working the way it's supposed to, because this is where a lot of home gardeners lose patience and give up. A backyard compost pile that just sits there can take a year or more to turn into anything usable. Families who've composted this way for generations get finished compost in 3 to 4 months, and the secret is heat. A properly built pile with roughly 30 parts dry material, dead leaves, straw, shredded newspaper, to about 1 part fresh green material, kitchen scraps, grass clippings, will heat up on its own to somewhere between 140 and 160 degrees at its core. That's genuinely hot. Hot enough that university extension offices will tell you it kills off weed seeds and most disease pathogens that would otherwise hitch a ride straight into your garden beds. Most backyard piles never get anywhere close to that, sitting instead at a temperature that barely does anything at all besides slowly rot. Turning the pile once a week with a pitchfork feeds it oxygen, which is what keeps that heat going instead of letting the pile go cold, damp, and smelly. Get it right, and you're looking at a finished, dark, crumbly compost that does the same job as a good deal of what you'd spend money on at a garden center for nothing but the price of your own effort. Season length is the other piece of this that surprised me the most when I first learned it, because I always assumed a short growing season was just something you had to live with wherever you happen to live. A cold frame, which is really nothing more than an angled box with an old window laid across the top, traps the sun's heat during the day and holds on to it through a cold night, keeping the soil inside noticeably warmer than the air outside. You can build one out of scrap lumber and a salvaged window for well under $30, and it will let you start seedlings weeks earlier in the spring and keep tender crops going weeks later into the fall than you'd manage otherwise. Planting a little bit at a time every couple of weeks, instead of putting your whole crop in the ground on the same day, keeps a steady trickle of fresh vegetables coming all season instead of one overwhelming harvest that spoils before you can use it all. And if you've got a cool, dark spot, a basement corner, an old root cellar if you're lucky enough to have one, you can store root vegetables and cabbages for months through the winter without a refrigerator doing any of the work. Let me explain a bit about why all of this actually works, because I don't want you taking my word for it without understanding the reasoning. Legumes, like beans and peas, host a particular kind of bacteria in little nodules right on their roots. And that bacteria pulls nitrogen straight out of the air, which is nearly 80% nitrogen to begin with, and converts it into a form the plant, and later the soil, can actually use. That's not folklore. That's basic plant biology taught in any agricultural science course. The heat in a properly built compost pile comes from the same microorganisms breaking down organic matter, generating warmth as a byproduct of their own activity. The same way a pile of damp hay or a stack of wet grass clippings will sometimes start steaming on a cold morning. Soil that's rich in organic matter holds water dramatically better than depleted soil does, which is why gardens fed with compost and manure over the years need less watering, not more, even in a dry summer. And tilling the soil every year, which most of us were taught was just good garden hygiene, actually destroys the very organisms, the fungi networks and the earthworm tunnels that keep soil structure loose and healthy. Leave soil undisturbed and feed it instead, and it builds itself back up year after year, rather than wearing thin. I do want to mention one thing you'll hear a lot of old-timers talk about: planting certain crops by the phase of the moon, root vegetables during a new moon, leafy greens during a waxing moon. I've heard my own relatives swear by it, and there are folks who've been doing it their whole lives with good results. I'll be honest with you though, the actual science behind it is thin, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's proven when it isn't. What I can tell you is that none of it costs you anything or hurts anything if you want to give it a try alongside everything else in this video, but I wouldn't build your whole garden around it the way I would the soil rotation and watering practices I just walked you through, because those are the pieces that are actually backed by real evidence and generations of results you can measure with your own eyes. Now let's talk about the money, because this is the part that really gets me. A single cubic yard of good finished compost does roughly the same job as somewhere around $200 worth of store-bought soil conditioner and fertilizer, and a family composting their own kitchen and yard waste can produce that much or close to it in a single year without spending a dime. Add in seed saving instead of buying fresh packets every spring, and you're looking at another $100 to $200 staying in your pocket annually. A cold frame built for under $30 replaces what would otherwise be a greenhouse costing hundreds. None of this is complicated or expensive. It's just not something a company can put a label on and sell you, which is exactly why you don't hear about it on the shelf at the garden center. If an old housewife's tricks like these are worth your time, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give this a thumbs up. It tells me you'd like more of these, and I've got plenty more where this came from. I also put this whole system, along with dozens of other little practices I picked up over more than 40 years of running a household on a tight budget, into a book called Linda's Homekeeping Handbook. It's not a lecture, it's just what worked, written down plainly the way I'd tell it to a neighbor over the fence. The link is right there in the description below if you want the whole thing in one place. Though here's what I want you to do this weekend, if you've got a garden bed sitting there that's been disappointing you. First, find a source of manure if you can. A neighbor with chickens or horses is usually happy to let you haul some away for free, and let it age at least a couple of months before it touches your vegetables. Second, start a compost pile properly, 30 parts dry material to 1 part grain, and commit to turning it once a week. Third, before you plant anything else, sketch out a simple rotation for your beds: heavy feeders 1 year, beans or peas the next, something that spreads like squash after that, then a resting year with a cover crop. Fourth, save seeds this fall from your healthiest, best performing plants instead of buying fresh packets come spring. Fifth, cut your watering down to 2 deep soakings a week at soil level instead of a daily sprinkle over the leaves. And sixth, if you've got the scrap lumber and an old window lying around, build yourself a cold frame before the season turns. It costs almost nothing, and it'll add weeks onto both ends of your growing year. Next time, I want to sit down with you and go through the exact laundry stains I fought for decades raising a family. The ones that no store-bought spray ever really got out, and the two ingredients sitting in most kitchens right now that outperform every one of them, without ruining a single fabric in the process. Tell me in the comments where you're gardening from and what your soil situation looks like right now, sandy, clay, something in between. I read every single one of these, and I'd love to know what you're working with. The women who kept this country's homes running new things we're only just starting to remember.